What if I told you that a trusted friend of the president, someone who once took a bullet for him, was secretly selling his country piece by piece to foreign agents? This isn't a Hollywood thriller, it's real, and it happened in Burkina Faso. Tonight we're diving deep into the incredible story of how President Ibrahim Traoré uncovered a hidden spy ring operating from within his own government. It's a tale of betrayal, intelligence, and one man's unwavering commitment to protect his nation. But before we begin this cinematic unraveling of secrets and loyalty, let us know, where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from Africa, Europe, Asia, the Americas? Drop your country in the comments below, because this story, though rooted in West Africa, speaks to a global struggle for sovereignty and truth. And if you're here because you love political intrigue, real-life espionage, and stories of bold leadership, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another episode like this. We drop powerful stories every week that explore the untold sides of modern leadership, geopolitics, and resistance. Now, buckle up, because what President Traoré faced wasn't just a leak in his circle. It was a full-blown attempt to destabilize a nation. And what he did next might just make you believe in heroes again. In a world where foreign influence quietly shapes politics behind closed doors, one man stood up and said, "Not here. Not on my watch." That man is President Ibrahim Traoré, a young, fearless leader of Burkina Faso who stared down the shadow of espionage and didn't blink. In today's story, we take you inside a hidden war, a silent conflict that never made global headlines but shook the very foundation of a nation. While the world was watching protests, coups, and international negotiations, something else was happening, a betrayal deep within the heart of power. It began with whispers, leaks, strange meetings, and a growing sense that someone, somewhere, was pulling the strings. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't rely on rumors. He turned to strategy. With the help of a loyal inner circle, he launched a covert investigation that exposed not just a single traitor, but an entire foreign-backed operation designed to destabilize his government from within. This wasn't just a political crisis. It was personal. One of the men involved had stood beside him in war, shared his meals, laughed at his jokes, and vowed loyalty. And yet, he had sold out his own people for promises whispered in another language. What follows is not just a tale of espionage. It's a masterclass in silent leadership, trust under fire, and the cost of choosing country over comfort. So, sit tight. What you're about to witness is a real-life political thriller. How President Traoré turned the tables on foreign agents, transformed betrayal into opportunity, and sent a clear message to the world. Burkina Faso will never kneel again. The wind that night in Ouagadougou carried more than just dust. It carried a feeling. President Ibrahim Traoré stood alone in his private office, long after the final reports were filed and the last minister had gone home. The flickering lights of the capital blinked in the distance, but Ibrahim's mind was elsewhere. Something wasn't right. He had felt it for weeks, maybe months, but it was no longer a whisper. It was now a weight pressing on his chest. There had been too many coincidences. A strategic military unit moved to the wrong location after a miscommunication. A confidential briefing on national security somehow leaked, ending up paraphrased in a foreign blog the very next day. And most recently, a convoy delivering humanitarian aid was intercepted by hostile forces, despite the route being changed just hours before departure. These weren't random. Someone was watching. Someone inside was feeding them. Burkina Faso had long suffered under the influence of foreign governments and multinational powers. Under Traoré's leadership, that grip had been broken. Foreign military forces were asked to leave. Mining contracts were renegotiated to favor local ownership. The nation's gold, its soil, and its voice had finally returned to its people. But that kind of independence didn't come without enemies. He knew they wouldn't give up so easily. Still, what troubled him most wasn't that someone wanted to bring him down. That was expected. It was how close the betrayal had reached. The leaks weren't coming from low-level clerks or outside hackers. The details that had been exposed were only available to a select few. People Ibrahim had fought beside, promoted, entrusted with the future of the country. It was a wound far deeper than politics. It was personal. At first, he kept his suspicions to himself. He rechecked every report, memorized faces in each closed-door meeting, observed body language during high-level briefings. He even began holding impromptu sessions at odd hours, just to see who always seemed conveniently prepared. The pattern was faint, but there. One man in particular had been too smooth, too perfect. Brigadier General Marcel Cabor. Cabor was an old friend. They had trained together, marched through the Sahel under the same scorching sun, and fought shoulder to shoulder during some of the most violent years of instability. He was composed, articulate, and widely respected. But lately he'd grown distant, less engaged with local concerns, and oddly defensive during strategy meetings. More than once, Ibrahim caught his eyes darting to his phone mid-discussion, then quickly locking it when questioned. The final straw came during a routine audit. A junior officer, reviewing encrypted communications for system testing, stumbled across a strange data packet. It was masked as agricultural inventory data, but the encryption was military-grade. Instead of silos and grain, the message inside outlined troop movements, logistical resupply chains, and the names of operatives embedded near the northern border. It had been transmitted to an unverified satellite channel, registered in Eastern Europe. When the report reached Ibrahim, he didn't react with outrage. Instead, he asked one question: who had clearance to this data? The list was painfully short. 7 people. Ibrahim himself, his chief of staff, 3 intelligence officers, and Cabor. He convened a midnight meeting with only 2 of his most trusted aides, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, no relation, and Intelligence Director Fatima Doumbia. There were no phones allowed, no transcripts, no aides. Just whispered strategy and sharpened resolve. Ibrahim stared at the encrypted message projected on the wall and finally said, "It's someone close, too close, and we'll confirm it quietly." Fatima proposed a monitoring protocol. Rather than confront anyone, they would tighten the net, re-encrypt critical files, and insert fake operational data into select channels to see if it too would leak. If the fake data appeared elsewhere, they would know exactly which access point had been compromised. The plan worked, better than expected. Within 72 hours, one of the fabricated mission details, a fictitious weapons transfer in the East, surfaced in a foreign security newsletter. A trace confirmed it had been accessed by a single user, General Traoré. Still, Ibrahim hesitated. He needed more than circumstantial evidence. He wanted to see the betrayal with his own eyes. So he instructed Fatima to activate Operation Black Mirror, a protocol designed for one purpose: to watch the watchers. Surveillance teams were deployed. Encrypted calls were flagged. Every digital footprint left by Cabor was tracked in real time, fed to a secure command hub beneath the Ministry of Defense. The more they observed, the clearer the picture became. Cabor was not acting alone. He was part of a larger network, receiving instructions, forwarding documents, and holding late-night meetings in non-governmental zones. One of his most frequented locations was a guest house owned by a foreign NGO. On paper, it was a language training center. In reality, it was a well-disguised meeting hub. One night, Ibrahim reviewed footage of Cabor stepping into that guest house at 2:14 a.m., greeted by 2 unfamiliar men in Western suits. No official diplomatic badges, no registration logs, just briefcases and hushed tones. It wasn't proof in court, but it was proof enough. That night, as he looked out over the capital from the rooftop of Koziam Palace, Ibrahim knew something inside him had changed. This was no longer just about defending a presidency or protecting borders. It was about honor, about loyalty, and about what kind of country Burkina Faso would become if traitors were allowed to thrive in silence. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he drafted a new directive, Let the traitor continue. Let him believe he's safe, because if we want to strike the head, we follow the tail first. The trap was now set, and the hunt had begun. The plan to expose the mole was in motion, but President Ibrahim Traoré knew he needed more than just surveillance logs and suspicious footage. He needed undeniable proof, the kind that not only unmasked a traitor, but also collapsed the entire web behind him. 2 days after Operation Black Mirror had begun, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Yassine Sow, a young communications officer stationed in the northern province of Soum. Yassine was monitoring routine frequencies used for agricultural coordination when she intercepted something strange. A shortwave transmission disguised as a crop yield report. But as she dug deeper, what she found made her blood run cold. Beneath the agricultural jargon was a sophisticated encrypted layer. She rerouted the signal through the National Cybersecurity Hub in Ouagadougou, where decryption revealed sensitive information, high-ranking personnel names, convoy schedules, and deployment maps that only the presidency's inner circle should have had access to. What truly raised alarm was the inclusion of new, fake details, planted just days earlier by Traoré's team as bait. The message had been extracted and retransmitted. That confirmed it. The spy was still active, and now, thanks to the bait, they had evidence that could hold up to international scrutiny. President Traoré summoned Lieutenant Yassine to the capital the same night. When she entered the private chamber in the palace, she didn't know what to expect. But instead of formality, she found Traoré standing by the window, his voice calm. "You just saved lives, Lieutenant. And you helped expose something far bigger." The decrypted data traced the outgoing signal to a mobile uplink used briefly near a diplomatic zone. Too brief to track physically, but long enough to pinpoint timing. Cross-referencing security camera footage and tower pings led them again to one suspect, Brigadier General Marcel Cabor. He had passed through that exact zone at that exact moment using a ministry-issued vehicle with tinted windows. This wasn't just espionage. It was coordinated infiltration, cloaked in diplomatic protections and hidden behind familiar faces. Traoré convened a war room inside a repurposed bomb shelter beneath the Koziam Palace. Only 5 individuals had access, including Yassine, Captain Aliou, and Director Fatima. Every piece of intelligence now pointed in one direction. Still, Traoré wasn't satisfied with knowing. He wanted admission. Spoken words, captured and undeniable, that would be the weapon he'd use, not only to clean house, but to send a message beyond borders. They crafted a trap. General Cabor was informed he'd be leading a strategic alignment meeting involving external consultants for regional stability. The location? A high-security military intelligence complex. The twist? Every room in that complex had been retrofitted for surveillance, with hidden audio and video gear capable of picking up even whispered conversations. And the consultants? They were members of Traoré's covert intelligence unit, trained to pose as foreign operatives. The stage was set. On the evening of the meeting, Cabor arrived in civilian dress, carrying a nondescript black portfolio. The moment he stepped into the conference chamber, the mood was crafted to feel routine. Just another night in a city used to tension. He shook hands with the advisors, sat down, and opened with casual small talk. But within minutes, things shifted. The consultants began referring to classified details with alarming familiarity. Information Cabor had only passed to foreign contacts a week earlier. He blinked, briefly stunned, before covering it up with a chuckle. "We've all got eyes where we need them, gentlemen," he said. "What matters is that the transition plan moves forward. The president won't see it coming." That sentence was enough. From the control room below, Traoré leaned forward, fists clenched, listening through the earpiece. He didn't need to hear more, but Cabor kept going. "The rural factions are already softening. Once the external pressure hits from the west, the military command will fracture. By then, I'll have enough leverage to step in and stabilize things." "Stabilize," Traoré muttered. He means take power. One of the fake consultants asked him about compensation. Kabor laughed. I'm not in it for charity. My friends in Geneva have assured me that post-transition, I'll be positioned for diplomatic engagement, perhaps even UN oversight in the Sahel. It's time Burkina Faso entered a new era, with or without Traore. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was systematic. Foreign powers weren't just collecting intelligence, they were cultivating future leadership from within Burkina Faso's military elite. The trap had worked. But Traore wasn't finished. He signaled the team, initiate Phase 2. Kabor was thanked and escorted from the building. He had no idea every word he'd said was already backed up in 3 encrypted copies. One already forwarded to Traore's legal defense team, and another heading to the African Union Intelligence Board. But the president wasn't looking for courtroom drama. He was preparing for something far more public and far more symbolic. The next morning, General Kabor was invited to a breakfast briefing at the presidential palace. He arrived in full uniform, proud and unsuspecting. As he stepped into the grand hall, the doors locked behind him. Traore stood at the head of a long oak table. Around him were only 4 people: his chief legal advisor, his national security director, the head of military protocol, and Lieutenant Yassine Sow. Kabore's smile faded instantly. "You've been busy," Traore said, sliding a file across the table. Inside were stills from the surveillance feed, transcripts of the conversation, and satellite images of his unauthorized movements. Kabor didn't speak. "You betrayed the very ground you swore to protect. And worse, you sold it to men who will never bleed for it." Traore didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You will answer to this country. But before that, you will help us burn the entire network down." The general sat in silence, cornered. There was no exit, no defense, no escape. And just like that, the lion had baited his prey and caught him in the trap he never saw coming. Inside the presidential hall, time felt frozen. The once proud Brigadier General Marcel Kabor sat stiffly at the far end of the long oak table, his chest still puffed in uniform, but his eyes betraying panic. Across from him stood President Ibrahim Traoré, not behind a podium, not surrounded by guards, just him, grounded, steady, and silent. The room was dim, no windows, only the soft humming of ceiling lights and the slow tap of Traore's fingers against the table. For a full minute, no one spoke. Then the president broke the silence. "You stood beside me in war," he said, his voice low. "You shielded my flank when we pushed through the eastern border 5 years ago. I never once doubted your loyalty." Kabor looked down, his jaw clenched. "But now," Traore continued, sliding the folder toward him, "you sold maps, names, plans, our future, for a seat at someone else's table?" Still, no response. Traore leaned forward, eyes locked on his former comrade. "Why?" Kabore finally looked up. "Because this country doesn't listen to its own anymore. The world has changed, Ibrahim. We can't win by isolation. We need partnerships." "Is that what they told you?" the president replied. "That we're weak alone, but strong when they hold the reins?" "They offered stability," Kabor said, almost pleading now. "Support. Infrastructure. Recognition. A seat at the international table. They said if you fell, I could bring order to the chaos. I believed—" "You believed a lie," Traore cut him off sharply. "They offered chains dressed as opportunity. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed every mother in a village praying for clean water, every soldier dying to defend this land, every child who thinks this flag means something." Kabor's composure cracked. He dropped his gaze, breathing unevenly. "They promised protection. I thought I could control it." "That's the thing about snakes," Traore said coldly. "They never crawl in unless you open the door." Then came the proposition. Measured, deliberate, sharp. You're not being thrown in prison. Not yet. You're going to help us dismantle everything. Every contact, every handler, every offshore account, every drop point. You're going to become the poisoned well they drink from, and when they realize they've been duped, it'll be too late. Kabore blinked. And if I say no? You won't, said Traore, because we already have your confession, because without our protection, you'll be worthless to them, and dangerous to yourself. They'll abandon you faster than they recruited you. Traore stood, signaling to Lieutenant Yassine to bring in the digital files. On a screen, the surveillance footage replayed. Kabore receiving the suitcase, the hushed conversation, the mention of destabilizing before elections. There was no way out. For the next 4 hours, Kabore gave them everything. Names, phone numbers, meeting locations, safe houses, diplomatic covers. He told them about Project Haven, a long-term strategy by a coalition of foreign agents to re-infiltrate West Africa through hand-picked military figures, NGOs, and compromised media. Burkina Faso was not the only target, but it was the current centerpiece. He described how intelligence was laundered through international development initiatives and how agents used job offers, visas, and foreign bank accounts to manipulate rising officers, the same tactics used in other post-colonial states. Remixed, rebranded, redeployed. When he finally stopped speaking, sweat clinging to his neck, Kabore looked at Traore. They won't stop. I know, the president answered, but neither will we. By the next morning, a new task force was assembled, under the codename Operation Emberline. At its core was a deception campaign, feeding fake intel back through the same channels Kabore once used. This time, the goal was simple: collapse the entire web from within. A new document leak was created, an elaborate file suggesting President Traore was preparing to move national gold reserves through a vulnerable military convoy. It was bait, laced with hidden trackers and digital watermarks. Kabore was told to leak it, using his exact old process. Within 24 hours, that file reached a foreign advisor operating under diplomatic cover near the embassy district. Within 72 hours, a second agent picked it up at a cafe. Within 96 hours, it was forwarded to a Western intelligence node in North Africa. The trap was working. Back at the Ministry of Defense, Captain Aliou and Lieutenant Yassine were coordinating silent operations across the capital, marking every suspected collaborator, tracing every reply, logging every suspicious signal. Then, a message came in. One of the handlers, operating under the alias Reed, requested an urgent meeting with Kabore at a neutral house just outside the city, an old villa previously used for language tutoring, now converted into a covert safe house. The plan was clear. Go in, fully wired, extract a full admission, trigger the takedown. In the minutes before the meeting, President Traore met with Kabore alone for the last time. The two men stood in silence until Ibrahim finally said, "I don't trust you, but I trust what they think of you. That's enough." Kabore nodded. "Let's end it." With a concealed mic sewn into his collar and a tracking chip in his belt buckle, Kabore entered the safe house. Inside were two men, Reed and a European agent known only as G. Their tone was sharp. "You've been quiet," Reed said. "Is Traore suspecting something?" Kabore kept his voice steady. "No. He's focused on the elections. I have the plan for the convoy." He handed over the fake file. Reed skimmed through it, then leaned in. "It's time, Marcel. No more delays. This presidency has to end before the vote. You understand?" Outside, hidden in darkness, Captain Aliou's team was listening. That was the signal. "Execute!" came the command. Within seconds, the doors burst open. Armed agents flooded the room, weapons trained, orders shouted. Reed and G froze. Stunned. "You're under arrest," Aliou said. Reed shouted, "We're diplomats!" "Not tonight," came the reply. "Tonight you're traitors." The operation had been swift, silent, and surgical. Within minutes, the two foreign agents were in custody, their belongings confiscated, and the safe house sealed off. But President Ibrahim Traoré knew that the real battle was just beginning. The arrests, though critical, were only the first step in a much larger counteroffensive, not against individuals, but against the entire narrative that had allowed such infiltration to thrive under the guise of cooperation. By dawn, the foreign ministries of the involved nations were already issuing carefully worded statements. They demanded the immediate release of their diplomatic representatives, claiming a violation of international law. Some even hinted at economic consequences. But Traore had anticipated this. What they didn't know was that the Burkinabe government had already prepared a full dossier, complete with surveillance footage, intercepted communications, and internal memos proving that these diplomats were in fact part of a coordinated espionage ring targeting the country's leadership. At 8:00 a.m., the government held a live press conference. President Traore appeared not in a business suit, but in his military fatigues. A visual statement as bold as any headline. Flanked by national security officials and young officers like Lieutenant Yassine Sow, he stood before the press with calm authority. "We will no longer pretend," he began. "For too long our sovereignty has been eroded under smiling handshakes and carefully worded agreements. But last night, Burkina Faso reminded the world, we are not anyone's puppet." He presented evidence, stills from hidden cameras, transcribed dialogue from intercepted messages, even audio recordings where agents discussed removing the president before the elections. Gasps echoed through the room. Then silence. Outside, a crowd had gathered, watching the broadcast on public screens. Street vendors paused. Shopkeepers turned up their radios. Students, civil workers, farmers. People across the country were listening. This isn't just an attack on a government, Traore said. It is an attack on every citizen who believes that their country should belong to them, not to foreign wallets or foreign agendas. Across embassies in Ouagadougou, panic set in. Some staff were quietly withdrawn. Others locked down internal records. Within hours, at least 3 foreign officials were recalled to their home countries. One unnamed ambassador was placed on indefinite reassignment. International news outlets were slow to react at first, some skeptical, others dismissive, but the footage was undeniable. When Traore's office released a 10-minute compilation showing one of the agents accepting a suitcase of cash in exchange for sensitive documents, global opinion shifted. Headlines began to reflect the gravity of what had occurred. Burkina Faso exposes espionage network tied to Western interests. President Traore declares diplomatic war on covert influence. A small nation, a big stand. Burkina Faso pushes back. But this wasn't just about exposure. Traore used the moment to launch a full diplomatic reset. He announced the immediate expulsion of 12 foreign representatives identified as part of the wider influence network. Their names, roles, and affiliations were published online, sparking controversy across multiple continents. He then issued a formal call to the African Union, urging other nations to reevaluate the presence of unaccountable foreign personnel on their soil. Simultaneously, his government rolled out an internal review campaign called Transparency First. Ministries were audited. Contracts signed with external consultants were re-examined. Military and civil sectors were briefed on the techniques used in psychological and economic manipulation. The goal was not only to purge the rot, but to inoculate the nation against future infection. Inside Burkina Faso, the reaction was electric. Universities hosted emergency panels to discuss neocolonial interference. Students marched, not in protest but in solidarity, waving national flags and chanting, "Our land, our rules." Tribal leaders from rural regions issued statements of support, praising Traore's strength and clarity. Even political opposition figures, often critical of his rule, issued rare commendations. "He may be our rival," one said on state TV, "but today he is our defender." Meanwhile, international observers scrambled to adjust. Nations accused of complicity distanced themselves from the caught agents, claiming they had acted without authorization. Human rights organizations called for transparency, but even they admitted the evidence was overwhelming. A few leaders, quietly, reached out to Ouagadougou, not with threats, but with offers to re-establish relations on new, equal terms. And through it all, Traore never wavered. In a televised interview aired 2 nights later, he was asked if he feared retaliation. He answered simply, "Retaliation is for those who think power is a throne. I don't sit on a throne. I stand with my people." He looked directly into the camera. "We are not a perfect nation, but we are a proud one, and we are awake now." In that moment, the world saw not just a soldier or a politician, but a man who had turned betrayal into strength, espionage into awakening, and a personal attack into a national rebirth. The storm had passed, but only on the surface. Beneath the global headlines and patriotic fervor, President Ibrahim Traoré knew that victory would not be measured in arrests or applause. It would be measured in how deep they could strike without ever being seen. The real war had just begun. While the press celebrated, Traoré and his intelligence circle met underground in the Ministry of Defense's Classified Operations Center, known only as Room Zero. Inside its concrete walls were real-time satellite feeds, intercepted chatter, and a digital warboard tracking active foreign influence networks across West Africa. The data pointed to a disturbing reality. The espionage ring dismantled in Ouagadougou was only one head of a hydra. Similar operations were being conducted in Mali, Niger, Guinea, and beyond. And now, they knew something the world didn't. They had a double agent. Brigadier General Marcel Kabouré, now stripped of rank and status, was not imprisoned, but redeployed. He had been given one task: to remain useful. Under 24/7 surveillance and with every step calculated, he would now become the decoy at the heart of a counterintelligence operation designed to mislead, divide, and dismantle the foreign networks still embedded in the region. His new role was dangerous. If the foreign handlers even suspected he had flipped, he would become expendable. But that was part of the plan. Kabour was reconnected to his original channels: encrypted messengers, dead-drop protocols, and seemingly casual meetings at cultural forums or NGO events. The information he passed, however, was now scripted by Room Zero. Carefully crafted files suggested mounting instability in the western provinces, exaggerated conflict among military factions, and secret plans to align Burkina Faso with an unnamed eastern power. Each document was laced with hidden digital tags, watermarks, tracking beacons, forensic metadata. When shared or transmitted, they would instantly ping intelligence servers, revealing the direction and location of spread. And it worked. Within 2 weeks, 4 foreign agents across 3 countries were exposed. One was caught attempting to flee Niger with a forged identity. Another vanished in Bamako. The third, posing as a medical researcher, was quietly removed after visiting a compromised academic conference. But the most significant breakthrough came through a simple message: an email from a secondary source in Côte d'Ivoire confirming that Burkina's transition plan has been approved. Proceed with regional destabilization. It was a clear indicator that a broader plan was still active, and that Burkina Faso had struck a nerve. President Traore remained publicly silent. While national attention turned to rebuilding and reform, he operated in shadows, meeting nightly with the Room Zero team, analyzing how every false leak rippled through enemy networks. Kabour, under tight supervision, delivered disinformation with surgical precision. But success required risk. One evening, Room Zero intercepted chatter that a summit of foreign operatives was scheduled in a neighboring country. Intelligence suggested the meeting's goal was to recalibrate strategy after the failed coup and exposure in Ouagadougou. For Traoré, it was the perfect opportunity, not to watch, but to intervene. Kabour was tasked with requesting an audience at the summit. Posing as a disgruntled military figure still embedded in Burkina's command, he offered unfiltered access to Burkina's defense protocols. If only he could be exfiltrated and guaranteed protection. After intense deliberation, the offer was accepted. Traoré's team prepared a full false briefing, a digital package mimicking military infrastructure layouts, strike readiness, and internal dissent reports. The briefing, of course, was embedded with undetectable trackers. At dawn, a small jet chartered under a foreign NGO landed in a private airstrip outside Niamey, Niger. Kabor boarded with a forged passport, a GPS implant beneath his shoulder blade, and a deep breath. What he carried was poison and bait. When he arrived at the summit site, a secured villa in a diplomatic zone, he was welcomed with caution. But greed overcame suspicion. Within 48 hours, Traoré's trackers painted a map of all devices that accessed the false briefing. IP addresses from embassies, military attachés, and even economic councils were recorded. The evidence was overwhelming. But Traoré didn't move on the intelligence immediately. Instead, he sent a signal. A leak to an international journalist known for neutrality and credibility. The journalist received only one document, one of the decoy files, along with a timeline of when and where it was accessed. Within days, an exposé ran in European media detailing how multiple foreign offices had engaged in unauthorized surveillance of Burkina Faso. Governments scrambled to respond. Some denied involvement, others blamed rogue elements, but the damage was done. In private calls, Traoré received apologies, cloaked as explanations, offers to reset relations. But he responded the same way each time. Burkina Faso will speak as an equal, or not at all. Kabore, after completing the mission, was quietly exfiltrated and placed in protective custody under a new identity. He would never again serve publicly, but his role in destabilizing the destabilizers had earned him a second life. Meanwhile, Room Zero expanded. What began as a defensive unit evolved into a regional intelligence alliance. Quietly, Burkina Faso began training analysts from neighboring countries, sharing counterintelligence techniques, and planting safeguards against further infiltration. President Traoré remained focused, knowing that the networks would mutate and return. But now the country had immunity. It had seen the virus, and it had fought back. This was no longer just a nation defending itself. It was a blueprint for resistance. Burkina Faso's silent war had shifted the balance, not just within its own borders, but across an entire region that had for decades danced in the shadow of post-colonial manipulation. What began as an isolated scandal, one hidden traitor, one intercepted message, had now evolved into a movement, one that questioned the very structure of international influence in Africa. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't plan to become a continental symbol, but history rarely follows intentions. His actions had become case studies, debated in university halls in Senegal, whispered about in the corridors of power in Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry. He was no longer seen just as the leader of Burkina Faso, but as the spark that reignited the question African nations had buried under trade agreements and development aid. Who really governs us? In the weeks following the Room Zero campaign, something remarkable began to happen. Ministers from neighboring countries, once cautious and skeptical, quietly requested access to the counterintelligence training programs pioneered by Burkina Faso. Delegates from Mali and Guinea sent observers. Even representatives from countries traditionally aligned with global powers began to question their dependencies. Universities invited Burkinabe intelligence officers to speak. Conferences once dominated by foreign consultants began featuring regional voices discussing sovereignty, data protection, and political self-defense. The concept of soft occupation, through NGOs, aid agencies, and diplomatic backdoors, became part of everyday political vocabulary. Traoré remained cautious. He had no interest in becoming a messianic figure. In a closed meeting with his cabinet, he said plainly, "We are not leading a rebellion. We are remembering who we are, and we are helping others remember too." But the change was undeniable. Public sentiment across Francophone West Africa was shifting. Artists composed songs in honor of the Lion of Ouagadougou. Youths painted murals of Traore with the words, "Truth doesn't kneel." Talk radio stations ran late-night debates about national independence and the illusion of foreign neutrality. It was as if a sleeping identity had been awakened. Yet with momentum came resistance. Foreign powers, rattled by the wave of narrative loss, increased their countermeasures. Media outlets began running concerned reports about authoritarianism and press freedom in Burkina Faso. Civil society groups, some funded externally, launched subtle campaigns questioning Traoré's legitimacy. He expected it. He had read this playbook before: doubt, divide, destabilize. But now, the people could see the strings. When a well-funded organization tried to circulate a fact sheet claiming that Traoré was turning Burkina Faso into an intelligence state, university students responded first. They held an impromptu symposium titled "Security vs. Subjugation: Who Really Watches the Watchers?" Thousands attended. Speakers tore apart the fact sheet line by line, revealing its foreign authorship and manipulative framing. The event was streamed across 5 countries. A month later, a coalition of West African journalists released a documentary titled The Shadow Game, tracing how soft power influence was used across the region to shape elections, draft constitutions, and control media narratives. The film included testimonies from former operatives, whistleblowers, and scholars. Traoré never appeared in it. He didn't need to. The story now had a life of its own. Diplomatic landscapes began to shift. Burkina Faso suspended several non-transparency aid partnerships and proposed a continental ethics charter for NGOs and foreign missions operating in Africa. The charter called for complete transparency in funding, operations, and influence declarations. While some international voices called it extreme, others, especially in the Global South, called it overdue. More surprisingly, the charter inspired movement beyond Africa. Civil society groups in Latin America and Southeast Asia began referencing it in their own pushbacks against economic colonialism and foreign-backed governance models. Traoré watched all of it unfold with both pride and caution. In another quiet evening meeting, he told Captain Alou, "We didn't start a revolution, we just told the truth. But once the truth breathes, it moves." Meanwhile, Room Zero had become more than a bunker. It was now the nucleus of a new alliance, the Sahel Integrity Pact. Through discreet cooperation with leaders in Mali, Guinea, and Niger, a network of shared intelligence, cyber defense, and independent journalism support was established. They didn't seek headlines, they sought resilience. Traoré remained at the center of it all, not loud, not flamboyant, but steady. He turned down interviews with international news agencies, choosing instead to speak through actions, policy, and local media. "Let the continent speak," he said. "The world will listen when it's ready." In early spring, he held a national address, not a victory speech, but a reflection. He stood on the steps of the National Assembly in plain uniform and said, "We have been lied to. We have been studied, measured, and manipulated. But we are not victims. We are awake now, and we will not trade sovereignty for silence." Applause rang through the capital, but Traoré raised his hand and added, "Sovereignty is not anger. It is discipline. We must be better than those who tried to buy us. We must build a future they cannot infiltrate." The message was clear. The war had taught them vigilance. But the lesson now was build, don't burn. Across the continent, more leaders began to speak carefully but boldly. Young Africans launched new platforms discussing decolonization in finance, technology, and defense. Rural farmers asked for clarity in contracts. Teachers included modern history in curriculums that didn't begin and end with colonial timelines. Burkina Faso had not become perfect, but it had become awake. And in doing so, it had reminded a continent that awareness was the first step, not to separation, but to genuine self-respect. And Ibrahim Traoré, once a young soldier in the background of dusty briefings, was now the steady voice in a growing symphony of nations saying, "We remember who we are." By the time the embers of the conflict began to cool, a strange transformation had taken place, one that even President Ibrahim Traoré hadn't anticipated. He had led Burkina Faso through a high-stakes political firestorm, confronted global manipulation, neutralized internal betrayal, and redefined the rules of engagement in West Africa. But now, something deeper was happening. He had become a symbol, not by declaration, but by necessity. Across the continent, his image was being shared not as a political figure but as a concept. On murals in Dakar, his silhouette stood beside the phrase, "Truth is resistance." In Accra cafes, university debates invoked the Traore doctrine when discussing post-colonial sovereignty. In music videos, spoken-word poems, and even children's school books, his story was reshaped, reframed, and reabsorbed into the cultural fabric of a generation hungry for dignity. Traore, aware of the power and danger of symbols, stayed grounded. He refused cults of personality. No statues. No renaming of streets. When local councils proposed building monuments, he politely declined, saying, "Let our children remember principles, not faces." But the moment was undeniable. In 1 year, Burkina Faso had shifted from being perceived as a fragile state to becoming a model of political clarity and moral courage. It wasn't about military strength, it was about truth, how it was weaponized, how it was hidden, and how, when released, it became explosive. In Room Zero, the data confirmed it. Disinformation campaigns had dropped sharply. Regional Black Ops communications had gone dark. Misinformation bots that once flooded West African platforms had ceased activity following the global exposé initiated by Traoré's team. Even cyber attacks on government systems decreased, likely due to international operators reassessing the risk of exposure. But more than metrics, there was momentum. For the first time in years, inter-African coalitions were forming without external facilitation. Leaders were connecting on secure lines. Shared intelligence platforms were launched. Joint agricultural and defense initiatives were drafted across the Sahel, built on trust, not dependency. And still, Traoré spoke less and did more. He visited schools instead of parliaments, military barracks instead of embassies. When he did speak, it was always direct, simple, unpolished, but honest. "We were never poor," he told a group of high school students one morning. "We were rich, in gold, in land, in memory. They just made us forget." That phrase echoed through TikTok reels, classroom discussions, and sermons in Sunday churches. Then came a pivotal moment. An international summit on African economic development, hosted not in Europe or the US, but in Lomé, Togo. For the first time in decades, major African heads of state met without the presence of donor nations, IMF representatives, or World Bank officials. Traoré arrived quietly, without entourage or fanfare. When it was his turn to speak, he stood at the podium in a modest linen suit and read from a single sheet of paper. "We do not oppose partnerships," he said. "We oppose puppetry. We do not fear cooperation. We fear conditions dressed as gifts." He paused. "We welcome friendship. But friendship stands on level ground, not on bended knee." The room erupted, not in applause alone, but in standing ovation. Several leaders, once cautious, rose with him. In that moment, a new language of diplomacy was born. One not of grievance, but of clarity. And that was the power of truth. It didn't shout. It didn't need to accuse. It simply stood still, unshaken, while the lies around it collapsed under their own weight. Back home, Traoré launched a national initiative called the Memory Project. It had one goal: to record, in oral and written form, the untold histories of villages, elders, and families across Burkina Faso. For years, global narratives had overshadowed local memory. Now, the people would write their own story. Mobile studios were dispatched to rural regions. Elders told stories of resistance, of dignity under colonial rule, of quiet triumphs never seen on TV. Children listened, wrote, translated. The National Archives swelled with thousands of voices that had never been documented. The world had spoken over them for generations. Now they were speaking back. In one interview, Traore was asked what made Burkina Faso's story different. He smiled slightly and said, "We didn't just survive interference, we understood it, and we taught others to recognize it too." Then came the question that often surfaced in foreign press. "Are you afraid this momentum will fade?" To which he answered, "No movement built on truth ever fades. It only becomes someone else's beginning." And across the continent, in classrooms, parliaments, refugee camps, and farmlands, that beginning had already begun. By the second anniversary of the espionage exposure, Burkina Faso had changed, but so had the very idea of leadership across the region. President Ibrahim Traoré remained in office, but the nation no longer revolved around him. That, in fact, was his design. He had redefined power not as something held, but something distributed. Ministries were streamlined, community councils were empowered with real decision-making authority. National broadcasts weren't filled with his speeches, but with debates, local interviews, and citizen voices. Traore had become a leader whose strength was felt most when he wasn't speaking. He turned his attention to one of the most fragile, overlooked foundations of any nation: trust in public service. It began quietly. Government offices opened walk-in listening rooms. Citizens could speak to volunteer clerks, anonymously if desired, about corruption, neglect, or suggestions for change. The idea spread so quickly that even regional governors adopted it. These weren't propaganda spaces. They were messy, emotional, raw, but honest. Schools shifted curriculum away from rote memorization and toward critical thinking. History classes taught not only the colonial past, but post-colonial resistance, including failures, betrayals, and unfinished struggles. Students were asked, "What would you have done differently?" It sparked discussions not about blame, but responsibility. Every reform was rooted in one principle: shared dignity. Not charity, not control, not pity. Traore refused the palace suite, choosing instead to live in a modest military residence and occasionally rotating between rural provinces. A president, he said, should sleep where the people can knock on his door. He carried no motorcade. Often, citizens would see him sitting alone at tea stalls in small towns, reading reports by hand. One shopkeeper in Bobo-Dioulasso told a journalist, "He listens before he decides. He knows the weight of silence." International observers called it unorthodox. The people called it honest. Diplomatic circles, still uneasy with his independence, attempted soft re-engagement. Some sent economic emissaries, others proposed infrastructure partnerships. Traoré responded with a simple doctrine: "We'll partner, but we choose the blueprint." Under this philosophy, Burkina Faso launched its own renewable energy initiative powered by local engineers, funded through a community-based bond system. It wasn't flashy, but within 1 year, 5 rural provinces had 24/7 electricity, for the first time in their history. Traore declined to take credit. He redirected attention to the engineers, the communities, and the local leaders who made it possible. "If people think only one man changed this country," he said in an interview, "then I have failed. It must belong to everyone, or it was never real." As the years moved forward, he laid the groundwork for a peaceful transition of leadership, not just through laws, but through culture. Term limits were not only protected, they were celebrated. Each year, a national day of stewardship was held, not to worship presidents, but to reflect on what had been built, neglected or lost in the previous year. Ministers were evaluated publicly. Retired civil servants gave lectures. Even youth councils published scorecards. One journalist noted, Burkina Faso didn't just reform its politics, it rehumanized them. Traoré's image slowly faded from posters and press, but not from the spirit of the nation. He had become a presence that didn't need to be present. That, perhaps, was the truest form of power. In an interview with a South African journalist, he was asked what legacy he hoped to leave behind. He paused, then said, I want children in villages to grow up thinking leadership is listening, not commanding. I want young officers to believe integrity outranks ambition. I want the world to forget my name and remember our example. By the time he quietly declined re-election in his final year, no mass campaign had been necessary. There were no rallies, no farewell parades. Just one televised message. I was not chosen to be celebrated. I was chosen to serve, and now it is time to pass the tools, not the spotlight. In his last act as president, he returned to the military school where he once trained. There, standing before cadets with their boots in the dirt and their eyes burning with purpose, he said, Your uniform is not your shield, it's your mirror. When you wear it, ask yourself, will the people see justice or fear? The cadets saluted, not because they were ordered to, but because they understood. And with that, Traoré stepped down, not into retirement, but into normalcy. Some said he went north. Others said he returned to farming. His staff refused to comment. No memoir, no portrait unveiling, just silence and legacy. A living one. There was no final chapter. No fireworks, no grand statue unveiled at midnight. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't leave behind a dramatic farewell. He left behind a living rhythm, pulsing through every school, every town hall, every soldier who now paused before drawing a line between authority and abuse. Burkina Faso had become something rare in the global landscape, a nation not defined by its wealth, size, or military, but by the clarity of its values. It had endured espionage, foreign pressure, and internal betrayal. But instead of collapsing, it had evolved. It had chosen self-awareness over submission, principle over power, and progress over spectacle. Other nations had begun to take note, not with envy, but with curiosity. In Latin America, community leaders referenced the Burkina method in grassroots governance reforms. In Southeast Asia, university theses compared Traoré's leadership model to traditional Confucian ideas of service-based legitimacy. In parts of the Middle East, young politicians asked aloud, what would our future look like if we built from within, not borrowed from without? Burkina Faso didn't export ideology. It exported an example. That example wasn't loud, it wasn't always clean, but it was real. International conferences began inviting Burkinabe delegates not just for economic talks, but to teach about counterintelligence strategy, decentralized leadership, and how a country could reclaim its own story. NGOs revised their models after facing public questioning. Embassies, once bloated with undisclosed agents, slimmed down or relocated entirely. But inside the country, the greatest shift was psychological. Citizens no longer saw themselves as dependents in a global system, they saw themselves as participants, even leaders. Farmers began forming cooperatives that didn't just wait for funding, they proposed regional trade routes. Youth groups lobbied for curriculum reform and were listened to. When a new president was elected, without drama, without foreign monitoring, there was a single sentiment. This is normal now. That was perhaps Traoré's most powerful legacy. He made dignity ordinary. He didn't need to remind people of what had been done. They were living it. A group of filmmakers from Côte d'Ivoire visited Burkina Faso 2 years after his departure to document the shift. They expected to find nostalgia. Instead, they found movement. Not a vacuum, but continuity. Traore's name came up rarely. What came up instead were ideas, quotes, processes. "We don't think about him every day," one market vendor told the crew, laughing. "But we live like he taught us." That's better, isn't it? Beyond the continent, global powers, once used to dictating African policy through backroom diplomacy, were forced to recalibrate. Analysts spoke of a Burkina effect, the shift from reactive to proactive sovereignty. Investment proposals were now met with legal review boards, civil society consultations, and digital transparency dashboards. The model spread faster than any treaty, but Burkina Faso never claimed perfection. Droughts still came. Infrastructures still strained. Corruption still crept, as it does everywhere. But the difference was this: people believed they had the right to challenge it. That belief, intangible but unshakable, was the hardest thing for any enemy to dismantle. And so, the nation moved forward, not as a utopia, but as a lighthouse in a stormy sea. A small republic that stood up, told its truth, endured its consequences, and came out not as a victim, but as a mirror to a continent, and perhaps to the world. One night, years after leaving office, someone reportedly saw Ibrahim Traoré at the edge of a field in the north, watching the stars. No camera, no guards, just a man in worn boots with a thermos of tea. A child walking home from school recognized him and approached. "Are you him?" the boy asked. Traoré smiled and handed him the thermos. "I'm someone who used to speak a lot," he said. "Now I listen." The boy blinked. "What are you listening to?" "The land," Traoré replied. "It remembers everything." This wasn't just a story about espionage, politics, or one man's rise. This was a story about what happens when a nation decides to remember who it is, and refuses to be rewritten by foreign hands. Ibrahim Traoré didn't ask for a spotlight. He didn't need one, because true leadership doesn't echo through applause. It lives in how people walk after the speech ends, how a country breathes after the cameras stop rolling. Burkina Faso didn't become perfect, but it became clear. And in a world clouded by noise, clarity is rebellion. So if this story moved you, made you think differently, or simply reminded you that courage still exists in quiet places, don't let it stop here. Let us know in the comments what lesson from this story struck you the most. Was it the way betrayal was handled with strategy instead of revenge? The choice to lead by humility? Or how a single leader turned truth into a national weapon? And tell us, which country are you watching from? Your voice, your insight, and your presence in the conversation matters more than ever. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you don't miss more powerful, real-world stories like this one. We're building a global community that doesn't just consume content, but connects through it. Share this video with someone who still believes leadership must look like ego and power. Maybe this will show them another way. Because in the end, stories like this don't belong to one man. They belong to all of us. And the next one could be yours.